Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Just for information, this session is being recorded and will be available at a later date. For those of you who have not previously joined us for a Threat Intelligence series, my name is Jack and I'm Quorum Cyber's lead intelligence analyst. And joining us today is our strategic analyst, Craig Watt. What we'll be discussing is a high-level strategic overview regarding developing cyber threats and how they're likely to emerge and pose dangers throughout 2024. This briefing also coincides with our comprehensive Intelligence Outlook 2024 report, which is available as of today, and you will receive an email shortly after completion inviting you to download your copy. Due to our limited time here, we'll be focused on the following key areas, all of which can be found within the written report. These are emerging developments, current global threats, and the timeline of global events which are assessed to greatly impact the cybersecurity across a plethora of private and public sectors. I'll kindly ask that questions are left to the end, as we'll be holding a dedicated Q&A, and we will have more than enough time. We'll be happy to address all questions that come to mind. Finally, before we fully dive in, I'd first like to cover the basics of strategic intelligence for those not accustomed to the terminology. So intelligence is broken down into three distinct layers, these being strategic, operational, and tactical, each of which covering different aspects. Strategic intelligence is at the top layer and covers high-level geopolitical oversight, emerging trends and adversarial motivations from which future hostile engagements can be assessed. During this briefing, we will be focused on the strategic level. I'd now like to hand you over to our strategic analyst, Craig Watt. Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, and good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned previously, our initial assessments will be based on malware developments and emerging attack vectors. As offensive cyber operations grow in sophistication as well as complexity, the trend of threat actors continuing to target organizations across the industry spectrum with a variety of enhanced tool sets and emerging malware capabilities will almost certainly continue in 2024. The Outlook report includes our assessments regarding numerous emerging developments within the cyber threat landscape. However, for the purpose of this briefing, it has been assessed that the following 5 attack vectors will likely be the most prominent cyber threats throughout the calendar year. Firstly, artificial intelligence, or AI, mobile and smart device targeting, hack-for-hire operations, supply chain attacks, and finally, critical national infrastructure, or CNI targeting. These will now be dissected individually with the potential impact of each. Firstly, it has been assessed to be highly likely that cyber threat actors will leverage artificial intelligence to implement scalable attacks through the generation of large target sets and more advanced intrusion methods. This will likely include automated phishing and social engineering operations, as well as the implementation of automated bots, AI-driven malware, and advancing deepfake technologies to sway public opinion through sophisticated manipulation techniques. It is highly likely that these platforms will be developed and offered as a service for threat actors to purchase on underground forums and the dark web. Moreover, as industry sectors adopt biometric recognition technologies for identity verification, AI will also likely emerge as a threat for security bypass techniques. Proactive risk management strategies, including the integration of AI defenses, will be required to mitigate the impact of misinformation on business continuity. Moving on, Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT units, will likely develop stealth-based techniques that can be launched against mobile and smart devices, similar to those implemented within the Operation Triangulation espionage campaign that targeted Apple products in Q3 of 2023. There is a realistic possibility that additional operating system architectures could also be incorporated to expand the scope of these surveillance operations. Such campaigns will likely involve attack vectors such as zero-click exploits, allowing threat actors to hijack targeted devices and subsequent access to sensitive data. Our next assessment is that there is a realistic possibility that nation-state APT units will incorporate hack-for-hire services offered by private sector offensive actors, or PSOAs, to expand the scope of their targeting profile to include competitive espionage operations. This assessment has been made based on intelligence indicating a trend of increasing levels of entities seeking to target rival businesses but lacking the technical expertise to launch cyber attacks. With the adoption of this offensive protocol, a wide range of industry sectors will likely be subjected to cyber espionage campaigns, whereby sensitive data will almost certainly be accessed and therefore compromised. Moving on to supply chain attacks, it is highly likely that financially motivated cyber criminal cartels will continue to scan the internet to opportunistically exploit unpatched systems, whilst taking advantage of trusted relationships between clients and vendors. Nation-state actors will leverage this form of compromise as an initial ingress mechanism of choice to conduct cyber espionage with government institutions cooperating with third-party suppliers. Further, it is likely that the efficiency of supply chain attacks will be enhanced by both the dissemination and infection of access software packages, allowing for victims to be selected for larger-scale compromise, as well as the spread of malicious code within target environments. A successful supply chain compromise will almost certainly allow threat actors to gain unauthorized access to sensitive data and resources, disrupt business operations, and to negatively impact the reputation of target organizations. Our final assessment involves critical national infrastructure targeting. Domestic violent extremist or DVE groups will likely target CNI and related assets in alignment with the growing trend of publicizing manuals that outline potential infrastructure weaknesses. The emergence of this form of CNI targeting will almost certainly be influenced by environmental violent extremists or EVEs, becoming disgruntled with the ever-expanding energy and transportation sectors. It is highly likely that nation-state threat actors will also launch offensive CNI operations to compromise critical infrastructure of rival nations during times of conflict and to limit the capabilities of competitors during times of tension. This form of compromise will disrupt the business operations of entities within a wide variety of industry verticals affiliated with CNI, and as such, organizations within the energy, construction, and healthcare sectors should maintain a high level of vigilance to this form of offensive cyber targeting. We will now cover assessments regarding the global threats relating to the following geopolitical entities with their featured offensive protocols. Firstly, Russia with its offensive operations, China and its related cyber espionage campaigns, Iran and its notorious influence operations or IO, North Korea and its financially motivated cyber attacks, and finally the Middle East conflict with an emphasis on the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. Starting with Russia, due to the invasion of Ukraine degrading into a state of attrition, Moscow-aligned threat actors will almost certainly continue to target Ukrainian CNI to support state objectives and compensate for recent military impediments. This targeting of CNI will likely be at its greatest in Q1, with the targeting of the energy sector during the winter months. Further, it has been assessed to be highly likely that expanded offensive protocols will involve Russian APT operations being directed at NATO-supporting states, with concentrated targeting against government, defense, and energy entities in retaliation to ongoing sanctions. Moscow will also likely employ proxies to implement destructive cyber attacks to inhibit cooperation between entities involved in providing Ukrainian support. Within this context, fluctuating periods of targeting against the transportation and logistics sectors will likely occur during delivery periods of support packages to Ukraine as Russia seeks to disrupt their supply. With growing economic pressures caused by sanctions, the targeting profile of Moscow-backed cyber espionage will likely expand to include regions within sub-Saharan Africa to gain the upper hand in sought-after economic partnerships within the region. Finally, from an industry sector-specific standpoint, there is a realistic possibility that housing associations will attract attention from Russian state actors, with NATO members being of particular interest due to the implementation of the Homes for Ukraine scheme in Q2 of 2023, whereby Ukrainian nationals were sponsored, allowing them to receive accommodation and support. Moving on to China, Beijing will almost certainly launch further sophisticated cyber attacks throughout 2024 to support established objectives of preserving the existence and legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party by advancing the reunification with Taiwan, expanding China's territorial claims within the South China Sea, and asserting global power. As the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, inch closer to their intelligence gathering objectives, it is likely that affiliated threat actors will pivot to a more destructive posture by launching cyber attacks against rival nation CNI and military assets with attempts to inhibit the competition. Surging Beijing-sponsored operations against the US will also likely be observed in response to recent legislation prohibiting the investment in Chinese-owned technology. It is highly likely that Taiwan will be a primary focus of Chinese state-sponsored IP theft as attempts to undermine Taiwan's advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, also known as their Silicon Shield, will coincide with attempts to beat the looming deadline of the Made in China 2025 initiative. Beijing will also likely launch cyber espionage campaigns against regions that have signed up to Belt and Road Initiative projects throughout Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, as they seek to leverage political relations to expand their foothold within these regions and to gauge repayment capabilities. To conclude, it has been assessed that Chinese state actors will likely focus on the following three specific industry sectors throughout the calendar year. Firstly, education entities with related Beijing objectives being that of state-level espionage and IP theft to improve the development of education infrastructure within the PRC. Secondly, with China stating their goal of surpassing US space technology capabilities by 2045, it is highly likely that cyber espionage will be a staple within the PRC's cyber protocols against the defense and aerospace sectors, with the objective of advancing its global standing, as well as to diminish the influence of the US across military, technology, financial, and political sectors. And finally, the healthcare sector, with Chinese-sponsored objectives including espionage, IP theft, and data exfiltration, to support the enhanced delivery of national healthcare within the PRC. Critical areas of interest for Chinese-affiliated IP theft will likely include the development of advanced drug trials, clinical medicine, genetics, biotechnology, neuroscience, and advanced medical devices, allowing for Beijing to compete with the West by introducing medications to the marketplace, thereby enhancing the Chinese economy. Moving on to Iran, the state stability concerns as well as regional interests of countering Israel and Saudi Arabia will likely fuel increased investment of Iranian cyber capabilities. Priority targeting will likely consist of organizations operated within the government, telecommunications, logistics, energy, and technology sectors based on Tehran's stakeholder status within the fossil fuel sector, as well as intelligence gathering requirements relating to the agenda of the Iranian government. Further, Iran will likely continue to employ proxies such as the Crimson Sandstorm and Hazel Sandstorm APT units that launched cyber espionage efforts at the latter end of 2023. This will provide the regime with plausible deniability to avoid direct attribution to overseas attacks. Despite this, the regime will likely continue to take credit for state-level campaigns to demonstrate their developing capabilities within the cyber threat landscape. However, easy-to-deploy influence operations will likely continue to form the foundation of Iranian cyber aggression with the objective of altering the perception of opposition entities. Despite the slight easing of political relations with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council, targeting will likely continue, resulting from the ongoing regional Cold War, with objectives almost certainly being Iranian ambition to have the regional balance of power tipped in their favor. As a result of continuing economic sanctions following the transition day of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, on the 18th of October 2023, certain restrictions on Iran's nuclear and missile programs have been lifted. However, with Iran's increasing non-compliance since 2019, the UN Security Council have decided to maintain certain restrictions, denying nuclear weapons testing or ballistic missile activities. It is therefore being assessed that there is a realistic possibility that Iranian cyber aggression will be launched in retaliation against Western government, military, and higher education entities, as the UK, with the support of fellow E3 members France and Germany, continue to apply restrictive measures against Tehran. This would allow the regime to pursue objectives relating to nuclear weapon development and to better gauge foreign strategies. In addition to this, with the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, recently reporting that Tehran now has enough enriched uranium at its disposal to generate, quote, several nuclear bombs, there is a realistic possibility that further Iranian cyber aggression could be aimed towards those regions maintaining sanctions with the potential greater intent to target the financial sector. This will likely be exacerbated by more stringent economic measures implemented by the West on Iranian proxies in response to related cyber aggression within the context of the Israel-Hamas war. Finally, it is likely that there will be increased cooperation between Iran and Russia within the cyber domain, reflecting the strengthening geopolitical relations between Tehran and Moscow. Throughout 2024, it is highly likely that North Korean-sponsored cryptocurrency theft and sophisticated supply chain attacks will be prioritized in response to stringent international sanctions and economic isolation. The revenue generated from these operations will likely fund state agendas, ranging from the maintenance of the Republic's political regime to its nuclear program. The latter will likely involve Pyongyang state actors exploiting zero-day security flaws with an emphasized targeting profile involving the government, financial, and defense sectors. Specific components of the supply chain will likely be most susceptible to compromise, including software vendors, as well as managed service and cloud providers, allowing for indiscriminate targeting and expanded offensive protocols such as ransomware deployment. The targeting of the West will likely be prioritized due to financially affluent target environments, the potential for IP theft, and the perceived existential threat of regions such as the US. However, cyber espionage campaigns targeting Japan and South Korea will also likely occur as Pyongyang seeks to gain situational awareness and advantage within the region. With state survival remaining a priority, heightened covert targeting of Russian defense industries will likely continue, with exfiltrated data enhancing North Korean military capabilities. This corresponds to significant portions of North Korean military hardware originating from the former Soviet Union. However, there is a realistic possibility that there will be a simultaneous escalation of overt North Korean cyber aggression in alignment with the strengthening of trilateral relations between Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing. This will likely transfer into the cyber domain in the form of increased targeting of Western supply chains as backing for Ukraine and Taiwan continues. Following the initial invasion of Israel by the Hamas militant organization on the 7th of October 2023, Tehran and Moscow-aligned hacktivist collectives will likely continue to target high-profile Israeli services, including government websites, media outlets, and energy infrastructure. Nation-state threat actors will also likely engage in destructive cyber attacks against Israeli government entities and CNI assets, as well as covert espionage operations within the region. It is highly likely that this will be spearheaded by the Iranian regime as they continue to leverage the Hamas kinetic military efforts to support their shadow war against Israel. Disruptive cyber attacks against CNI will likely be launched by members of the Axis of Resistance Alliance, including Lebanon-affiliated threat actors to counter Israel. However, it is likely that activity levels will be limited, reflecting both Lebanon and Iran seeking to avoid major conflict with the US. Finally, based on recent trends, there is a realistic possibility that Iranian cyber aggression will spill over into civilian sectors with expanded targeting of organizations either affiliated with the Israeli state or sympathetic to its cause. This assessment has been made based on the following recent Tehran-aligned cyber operations. Firstly, attacks launched by the Iranian Nexus threat actor Cyber Avengers targeting Israeli-made programmable logic controllers, or PLCs, utilized by multiple organizations within the US utilities sector. Moving forward throughout the calendar year, the energy, manufacturing, and healthcare sectors will be at particular risk of this expanded offensive profile due to the presence of targeted Israeli product lines. Secondly, heightened hacktivist operations launched against Gulf region entities likely initiated in response to normalized ties with Israel, an example being the UAE and Bahrain signing the Abraham Accords. This represented a departure of hostilities and rejection of Israel issued under the Khartoum Resolution at the 1967 Arab League Summit, in which the member nations agreed not to recognize the sovereignty of the Israeli state in alignment with pro-Palestinian support. Thirdly, with Israel being a major arms exporter, it is highly likely that their defense and aerospace sectors will be targeted by anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian threat actors. These cyber attacks will likely spill over, impacting Western nations importing Israeli-made weapons, including the UK and the US, as well as Gulf region nations due to the aforementioned normalized relations with Israel. And finally, dedicated targeting of high-profile organizations with apparent Israeli ties, exemplified by the anonymous Sudan hacktivist group targeting OpenAI due to its alleged bias towards the Israeli state, in conjunction with one of its founders holding both Israeli and Canadian citizenship. Numerous significant global events are scheduled for 2024 that will almost certainly coincide with escalated nation-state sponsored and aligned cyber aggression. With numerous high-profile elections on the horizon, it has been assessed that the integrity of the democratic voting process will almost certainly be tested, as nation-state level agendas will inevitably be pursued. In this section, key global events and the related assessments will be covered. However, for a full breakdown of all major events scheduled for the calendar year, please refer to the Outlook report. First up, NATO has scheduled a live joint steadfast defender military exercise to occur between the months of February and March. The exercise is reportedly going to take place in Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, and will involve the assembling of troops and the rehearsal of combat missions in preparation for potential Russian military aggression against a NATO member. Pro-Russian threat actors will likely seek to interfere with the exercise with proactive measures to hinder military advances that would pose a threat to Russian state objectives. Further, Moscow-aligned hacktivist collectives will likely protest the exercise by conducting a series of distributed denial of service, or DDoS operations, against high-profile organizations within the participating countries. As such, it has been assessed that the healthcare, education, media, finance, construction, logistics, and automotive sectors within NATO states should maintain a high level of vigilance throughout this period. Evidence of this targeting has already been detected, with the no-name 057 hacktivist group outlining their intention to launch widespread DDoS operations against UK organizations in response to the UK and Ukraine governments signing an agreement on security cooperation involving the UK sending 20,000 military personnel to the upcoming NATO military drill. Moving on to the 24th of February, this will mark the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. With regional tensions highly likely to ramp up on this date, Russian-aligned hacktivism will likely escalate throughout this period to promote pro-Kremlin narratives. In response, there is a realistic possibility that Ukrainian counter-cyber operations, aligned with the main Directorate of Intelligence, or the GUR, will be launched against high-profile Russian assets to mark the anniversary. The 2024 Iranian legislative election is scheduled for the 1st of March, whereby voters are due to select representatives for the Majlis and the Assembly of Experts institutions. With the former playing a pivotal role in bolstering the regime's stance on increasing uranium enrichment, it is highly likely that Tehran-backed cyber operators will conduct influence operations with the objective of stabilizing the political climate within Iran, as calls for change may occur following the economic restrictions in place following the transition date of Iran's nuclear deal. This election will also likely provide motivation for Iranian-aligned hacktivists to launch DDoS operations to propagate sentiment in solidarity with Tehran. As such, it has been assessed that high-profile organizations within the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Israel will be priority targets throughout this period. The first round of the 2024 Russian presidential election is scheduled to occur on the 17th of March, with a possible second round in April. With continuing economic sanctions resulting from the ongoing Ukrainian conflict, it is highly likely that the economy and the invasion will be key driving points for voters. This election will likely provide motivation for Russian-aligned hacktivists to launch DDoS operations to propagate sentiment in solidarity with the Kremlin. It has therefore been assessed that high-profile and public organizations within NATO member states will be priority targets during this period. The 2024 Ukraine presidential election is scheduled to be held on the 31st of March. However, due to the prohibition of Ukrainian elections in response to the enactment of martial law following Russia's invasion, there is a realistic possibility that the election will be postponed. However, the following assessments have been made with the assumption that the election will indeed go ahead. With Russia currently controlling approximately 1/5 of Ukrainian territory and almost 6 million Ukrainian nationals seeking refuge in other European states, it is highly likely that the electoral process will be primed to be influenced by disinformation campaigns. Despite the lack of certainty surrounding the election due to the state of martial law, Russian-affiliated threat actors will highly likely leverage artificial intelligence and deepfake technology to interfere and influence the voting towards Russian interests. With pro-Russian parties no longer a factor as a result of the conflict, Ukrainian cyber units will likely enhance their operational protocols to ensure that the current President Volodymyr Zelensky remains in power, thus solidifying patriotic consensus. Moving into Q2, the 2024 South Korean legislative election is scheduled for the 10th of April and will determine the constituent seats of the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea for the next 4 years. Targeted North Korean cyber aggression will likely escalate throughout this period, with the National Election Commission, or the NEC's network, likely to be targeted due to the potential for data exfiltration, as well as warnings from South Korea's National Intelligence Service. The 2024 Indian general election is scheduled to occur between April and May to elect the members of the lower house of India's parliament. Based on the economic and regional rivalry between India with both China and Russia, there is a realistic possibility that Moscow and Beijing-aligned threat actors will conduct influence operations as well as disinformation campaigns based on their geopolitical interests. A third term for Narendra Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party, or the BJP, would be in Moscow's interest, with the likely result being a continued neutral stance on the ongoing Russian-Ukraine conflict. Beijing-sponsored threat actors will likely continue to implement a suite of cyber warfare tactics to leverage India's trade deficit, the unresolved 2020 India-China border dispute, and continued Chinese military incursions into Indian territory. The run-up and aftermath of the election will likely coincide with a surge of election-themed phishing campaigns targeting Indian citizens, as well as organizations that have a business footprint within the region, such as third-party IT management firms. Moving on, the European Union Parliament election is scheduled for the 6th to the 9th of June, with EU member states due to implement key appointments, including the new president of the European Commission. Russian cyber operators will likely target European government entities during this period to disseminate pro-Kremlin and anti-Western narratives in response to NATO's support for Ukraine. Sophisticated cyber espionage will also likely be conducted to gather details on Western foreign policies towards Moscow. Furthermore, due to the importance of the elections, cyber criminal cartels will likely leverage the event as a capture point for financially motivated widespread phishing campaigns. Moving into Q3, the 2024 NATO summit is scheduled to be held in Washington, D.C. between the 9th to the 11th of July. With the agenda of the summit slated to include modifications in policies surrounding military funding and national security matters, such as the war in Ukraine, it is highly likely that Russian cyber aggression will surge throughout this period. Cyber espionage efforts will likely be launched by Moscow with the objective of gathering intelligence regarding NATO policies in an attempt to gain military advantage within the context of the ongoing conflict with Kiev. Moreover, high tensions between Beijing and Washington suggest that there is a realistic possibility that Chinese cyber espionage will accompany the proceedings, targeting NATO governments as well as the aerospace and defense sectors. The 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games are scheduled to take place between the 26th of July and the 11th of August in France, with Paris as the main host city. The Games will provide financially motivated threat actors with the opportunity to target the retail sector, which will likely involve fraudulent online ticket sales with the objective of financial data and credential theft. The event will also provide a rich environment from which organized cyber criminal cartels will likely conduct widespread phishing operations throughout the summer period. In alignment with previous years, nation-state level threat actors will likely attempt to sabotage the Games. This was observed during both the 2018 Winter Olympics as well as the 2020 Tokyo Summer Olympics, in which Russia's GRU military intelligence service engaged in cyber reconnaissance, targeting officials and organizations involved in the events. Based on these previous trends, it is likely that the 2024 Games IT systems, as well as devices within the French region, will be targeted by Moscow-aligned offensive protocols with the objective of sabotaging the event in line with the sponsoring state interests. Organizations with a business presence within the region should therefore maintain a high level of vigilance throughout the summer period to avoid potential business disruption. Finally, with increased domestic and international transport surrounding event attendance, there is a realistic possibility that hacktivist DDoS operations will be launched against a commonly selected target of choice in transport hubs for maximum impact during the Games. Legislative elections are scheduled to occur on the 30th of September to elect the 28th National Council, the lower house of the Austrian Parliament. With the pro-Russia Freedom Party of Austria currently ranking first in early polling statistics, there is a realistic possibility that covert Russian-aligned influence operations will escalate during the lead-up to the election, with efforts to ensure the party candidate's success. Moving into Q4, the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, is scheduled to be celebrated on the 1st of October. It has been assessed that Chinese-affiliated cyber influence operations aimed towards both the Taiwan and Hong Kong media sectors will escalate leading up to the celebration of the PRC's 75th anniversary. Next up, the 7th of October will mark the one-year anniversary of the Hamas invasion of Israel. In an attempt to promote pro-Palestinian rhetoric, Iranian-affiliated hacktivism and influence operations will likely escalate during this period. Heightened hacktivist operations will likely be launched against high-profile Israeli services, as well as Gulf region entities with normalized ties with the Israeli state, including those within the UAE and Bahrain. There is also a realistic possibility that Russian threat actors with a history of targeting Israel will conduct cyber aggression to mark the anniversary in an alignment with the strengthening geopolitical relations between Tehran and Moscow, as well as retaliation to Israeli support for Ukraine. American citizens are scheduled to elect the president and vice president for the upcoming four-year term in the 60th quadrennial presidential election scheduled for the 5th of November 2024. Nation-state-sponsored threat actors will almost certainly seek to exert influence to manipulate the election, with operations likely to include state-level espionage, influence operations, and impersonation attempts that will be aimed towards both voting systems as well as civilian voters. With Washington openly declaring substantial support towards Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, the results of the election will almost certainly be critical as it pertains to the global objectives of Russia, China, and Iran, respectively. Moscow will likely seek to leverage cyber influence operations to promote candidates sympathetic to Russia's foreign policy objectives, a main priority being disrupting US support for the current Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Likewise, Iranian-aligned influence operations will likely be launched with the objective of sowing discord amongst US voters and inciting violence against US government officials. This will likely be influenced by the US-Israeli alliance within the context of the Hamas invasion, acting as a buffer to prevent Tehran escalating warfare efforts. China's increasing interest in the Taiwan Strait will likely result in surging Beijing state actor operations throughout this period, as a potential conflict within the region could be influenced by US desires to preserve stability within the area. The PRC will likely launch aggressive social media disinformation operations against US businesses and government officials to shape the global information domain in favor of Chinese interests. These nation-state-sponsored offensive protocols will likely impact the technology sector, as artificial intelligence capabilities will be leveraged, allowing for scaled campaigns, resulting in social tensions, as well as the erosion of confidence in US establishments. Finally, with the noted Republican Party priorities towards financial expenditure involving a shift from foreign to domestic aid, it has been assessed to be likely that Russian influence operations will escalate leading up to the polls to influence voters in favor of a conservative victory that could impede future military and economic support for Ukraine, negatively impacting Kiev's sustained kinetic warfare efforts. To conclude this section of the intelligence briefing, the next United Kingdom general election is scheduled to occur on a date no later than the 28th of January 2025. However, the current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak recently indicated that the election is expected to be called in the second half of 2024. With a potential Labour victory likely resulting in attempts to mend relations between the UK and the European Union, Russian and Chinese-aligned threat actors will likely target the election via influence operations as well as disinformation campaigns to manipulate the public consensus whilst attempting to maintain this fractured status. The election period will likely result in an uptick in phishing campaigns, leveraging the election as a capture point. Organizations across the UK industry spectrum can therefore expect a surge in attempted phishing attacks as organized cyber criminal cartels seek to capitalize on the event.
Thanks, Craig. Awesome job as always. Lots of great insight for what can be expected over the next 12 months, with many key events scheduled to occur. I would just like to reaffirm the intelligence so what. So this is how this affects us in both the private and public sectors. And for that, we have three key takeaways. Firstly, we have election interference leveraged throughout most sectors. So with a wave of expected global elections, we will almost certainly see an intense surge of misinformation campaigns and political disruption throughout 2024. Nation states and their sponsored threat groups will likely conduct this via both overt hacktivism in the form of DDoS and covert social engineering via social media platforms. And secondly, we'll see a phishing uptick, events such as elections, conflicts, and the Olympics will almost certainly provide organised crime groups with a rich target environment from which to leverage, resulting in heightened ransomware seeding via tailored phishing campaigns. And finally, we expect surging third-party and supplier attacks. State targeting across Europe, Middle East, and East Asia will highly likely reflect this destabilizing political spectrum with spillover into the private sector. This has already been seen with attacks targeting those even loosely affiliated with Israel and Ukraine. So as mentioned earlier, this briefing coincides with our written 2024 report, which is available now. Within this report, you will find a 2023 wrap-up, statistical analysis, geopolitical considerations, emerging 2024 trends, the full 2024 event timeline, and sector-specific threats. This has been designed to read now so that you can get ahead and be prepared for cyber threats that will arise through the next 12 months. As mentioned previously, you will receive an email shortly inviting you to download your free copy. And that concludes our section of the briefing and goes into questions. Now, are there any questions? Gillian, are mics available for the attendees?
So at the moment, we do have a question from Gary. I will just unmute you just now.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can.
Hi there, good evening. What are your thoughts at the moment on the rise of AI and also specifically deepfake, where an actor would, say, create a spoofed video of someone? Is that going to be a big thing this year, do you think?
Craig, this one's over to yourself.
Yes, and most certainly will be a major effect. This has been escalating throughout the previous 10-year period approximately. But with the development of technologies, it will almost certainly be a major factor, especially throughout the periods that we mentioned in terms of the global timeline. So one of the things that we emphasized in the briefing at the beginning was that throughout this period in particular, AI-based defenses should be implemented with greater scrutiny. So these are really just the main cyber defense strategies that are already in place. However, one of the main emphasis I'd like to make would be kind of increased end user awareness of these types of attacks, because they tend to be the greatest weakness in the chain with regards to these potential disruptions. But yes, certainly this will be an issue. And again, just throughout those periods in particular, heightened vigilance to that type of attack should be maintained.
I'd also like to point out the pace in which this AI technology is developing is rather scary, to be honest. So 5 years ago, OpenAI, ChatGPT, no one really heard of these organizations, of this sort of software technology, and now it's everywhere. So it's increasing at an exponential rate and will continue to increase at that rate as well. Thank you, Gary. Does that answer your question?
Yep, it does. I've got another question as well. And also with the upcoming Windows 10 end of life as well. What's it shaping like, or what's it looking like out there, and businesses needing to get on to Windows 11?
Yeah, so with end of lives, lots of organizations can be very slow to change over. So whilst we have this transition period, there will be a distinct sort of gap in that security environment, with no longer patching being available for those systems. So we recommend that companies have robust vulnerability management in place, so that when doing active scanning on such systems, so vulnerabilities do crop up to affect it, then action can be taken on that as well. I'd also like to highlight that we write threat intelligence bulletins when critical vulnerabilities are released, so that you can get full, you're swept up on what the impact for those vulnerabilities can be and how to act as well. Any more questions?
So we do have another question in the chat from Max, and he's asking how long until Chinese and Russian interests no longer align in a more public-facing perspective in a way that affects the ROW?
Sorry, ROW. Can you just elaborate on that, please?
Max? Rest of the world.
Fair enough.
Thank you for the swift reply.
Yeah, so I would say there would be a continued strengthening of those relations going forward. One of the things to emphasize would be that as NATO members continue to mitigate against attacks from, say, Russia, for example, both China and Russia are expanding their presence within regions in the Southern Hemisphere to bolster their infrastructures, both internally and externally. So that will almost certainly continue going forward, which I think is very much worth bearing in mind. So organizations with a presence in those regions should absolutely maintain vigilance with regards to that. And that seems like it's going to continue going forward.
Going into the very strategic side of things. So Russia and Chinese interests are very much aligned at the moment. So you've got Russia targeting Ukraine, and you've got Europe shutting off the tap to Russian oil. So Russia needs a new customer for that business. And what they're doing at the moment is constructing new pipelines down into China to supplement that. But also China needs Russia for that as well, because China uses a lot more oil than they currently produce. And there are a lot of geographical choke points across the world that will stop the oil going through to China. So if Chinese aggression towards Taiwan increases and a conflict does break out, those choke points will be strangled, and China will no longer have the oil to continue. So those pipelines are vital. So you have massive dependency between each country there. So whilst that dependency is there, we will see that reflected in the cyber domain as well.
Okay, we do actually have another question as well from Gavin, and it's, what are the most prevalent techniques being used currently to gain initial access to UK organisations, and what are the most prevalent malware families being used in these intrusions?
Yeah, so this year actually, so going back previously, what we've seen is phishing campaigns being the #1 method of exploitation, method of entry. However, this year, end of 2023, that shifted to the exploitation of zero-day vulnerabilities. So going forward into 2024, we can expect that trend to continue. Now, when it comes to exploitation, threat actors are getting more and more creative. So at the end of the year, midway through the year, going through to the end of the year, we saw mass exploitation through Microsoft Teams. And that's like a new phishing tactic through Microsoft Teams, which we're seeing there. But also lots of just zero-day exploitation as the main way forward. But Craig, do you want to elaborate more on the third-party supply sort of methods as well? Because that's massive going forward.
Yeah, so as Jack mentioned, supply chain attacks absolutely will be on the rise, as we've seen through various high-profile vendor exploits throughout 2023. And this has continued even into Q1 of 2024, for example, Avanti. So this will likely continue. Again, like Jack mentioned before, ransomware operators primarily will take advantage. So financially motivated threat actors will take advantage of this vulnerability. So just to emphasize that strong vulnerability management enforcement is absolutely recommended, and patching is also required as well as these continue to develop. And just as Jack mentioned previously as well, just as a reminder, we do produce threat intelligence bulletins with the latest zero-day disclosures, with the appropriate mitigation and remediation strategies that are recommended for organizations to implement to reduce the potential of compromise as well.
Okay, so we've got another couple of questions. So the next one is from Colin. Do you envisage advantages in quantum computing having any significant impacts or influence this year?
So quantum computing is around the corner. Google has a massive one at the moment, but it's in the early stages. I can't imagine threat actors will get their hands on it just yet. But going forward, probably 2025 and beyond, then yes, absolutely. Quantum computing is like massive capability, but probably not at this moment in time.
Okay, we have another question from Harry, and it's how do we differentiate between real and accurate threat intelligence, between that driven by government propaganda?
Who likes one?
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, of course. How do we differentiate between real and accurate threat intelligence, between that driven by government propaganda?
Okay, so government propaganda-based attacks are primarily going to be implemented by hacktivist groups that we mentioned throughout the report and the webinar here. So these hacktivist collectives tend to be associated and aligned with ongoing geopolitical interests and warfare that goes on throughout the world. So the main thing to keep in mind is that although hacktivism is a relatively low threat compared to, let's say, state actor advanced malware intrusion, the effect is still very much there. And just to bear in mind that hacktivist operations are always either exaggerated or limited in impact, but they are absolutely there to be kept in mind going forward.
Also, as well, I'm trying to elaborate on that a little bit as well. So, define the differences between real intel and sort of some propaganda intel. That's why we use the strategic side of things, because then we can see the motivations of organizations, the motivation of threat groups, and the motivations of nation states. And if there's intel that is wildly different to the assessed motivations, then we've got to look at it and say, is this correct? And you can never take information from face value. You've always got to get information from multiple different sources and bring it together to make your assessment. So if there is something that's outlying, you've got to look at that a bit further and say why. So that's how we differentiate between real and government propaganda.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I guess point on I'm always interested in as well as adding on to like our psychology around it, because I notice, especially nowadays in the media, the public almost becomes cynical of these states and the people of these states, and it's just making sure security professionals, we're almost saying it's a geopolitical, but it doesn't mean the people of these countries are.
100%. Yeah, I can agree more with you. So from our point of view as intelligence analysts, you've got to take a step back and try and be as non-biased as possible and just look at the situation itself, not taking into account the people, but looking at the people who are running sort of the organizations, people who are running the country, and sort of like seeing the geopolitical strategies behind that to say, why is this happening? You can't get emotional about these things. You've got to take a step back and look at it from a face value, like black and white.
Thank you.
So at the moment, there are no more questions in the chat.
Fantastic. If any more questions do arise, on screen now you can see our contact details. So that's our threat intelligence group mailbox here at Quorum Cyber. If there's anything that you think about going forward once you close this down, please let us know and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I mentioned this a few times, but our Outlook report is available now, and you should receive an email very shortly inviting you to have a look, get your own copy, and I fully encourage you to do so. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Julian, I think that's it.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for attending.